In 1964, Pontiac built the car that invented the muscle car era. By 2010, Pontiac didn't exist. Same company, same factories, same badge that once meant excitement, gone in less than 50 years, not because of a recession, not because nobody wanted their cars, but because of one decision made inside General Motors that quietly poisoned the brand for 3 decades before anyone admitted it was happening. And here's the part that should scare every company watching this video. The decision that killed Pontiac didn't look like a mistake at the time. It looked like smart business. It looked like saving money. Every spreadsheet said it made sense. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a division that built the GTO, the car, the legend, the actual birth certificate of the muscle car, ended up selling rebadged Chevrolets for less money than Chevrolet itself. Stick around, because the final numbers on what this decision actually cost General Motors will genuinely shock you. To understand how far Pontiac fell, you need to understand how high it once stood. Pontiac wasn't always the performance division. For decades, it built solid, forgettable, slightly upscale Chevrolets for people who wanted a little more chrome. Then in the late 1950s, a young executive named Simon "Bunky" Knudsen took over the division and decided Pontiac needed an identity. Something you could feel, not just drive. He pushed the brand toward V8 power, aggressive styling, and marketing built entirely around one word: excitement. It worked spectacularly. In 1964, an engineer named John DeLorean, yes, that DeLorean, helped stuff a massive V8 into a mid-sized Tempest body and created the GTO. Historians still argue about who technically invented the muscle car, but nobody argues that the GTO is the car that made the category a phenomenon. It sold like nothing GM had seen before, and suddenly Pontiac wasn't the division for people who couldn't afford a Buick. It was the division for people who wanted to go fast and look good doing it. Through the late 60s and 70s, that identity held. The Firebird and Trans Am became cultural icons. The car Burt Reynolds outran cops enduring Smokey and the Bandit, the car that later played Kit on Knight Rider. Pontiac had built something most car brands never managed to build, a personality people were emotionally attached to. And then, starting in the 1980s, GM's accountants got involved. Here's the moment everything changed, and it wasn't a single dramatic boardroom vote. It was a philosophy that crept in gradually and never left. General Motors in the 1980s was managing 5 separate brands: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, and each one needed its own version of practically every car in the lineup. Building 5 genuinely different engineering platforms for 5 brands was staggeringly expensive. So GM made a decision that, on a spreadsheet, looked completely rational. Instead of engineering unique cars for each division, they'd build one shared platform and then let each brand simply change the grille, the taillights, the wheels, and the badge. This is called badge engineering. And once GM leaned into it, Pontiac stopped being a car company with its own identity and started being a Chevrolet with a different sticker price. The examples pile up embarrassingly fast. Pontiac sold a rebadged Chevy Monza as the Sunbird. When GM's new front-wheel drive J-Car launched in 1982, Pontiac slapped on the name J2000 and even took a rebadged Chevette and called it the T1000. A performance brand, the same one that gave America the GTO, was now selling a barely disguised economy hatchback with a numbers and letters name nobody could remember. To be fair, Pontiac tried to fight the sameness. Stylists pushed for bold looks on cars like the Grand Am, and since they couldn't get new sheet metal or unique engineering approved, they compensated with something cheaper: plastic body cladding. Slap black plastic trim around the wheel wells and rocker panels, and suddenly the car looked more aggressive without costing GM a dime in actual engineering. It became Pontiac's signature look for 2 decades. On the Grand Am, the Bonneville, even the ill-fated Aztec. What started as a clever workaround became a crutch and eventually a punchline. Here's the trap badge engineering sets. It doesn't kill you immediately. Sales don't collapse overnight. The damage is slower and far more dangerous. It kills the reason customers choose you over the competition in the first place. Think about what that actually means from a business standpoint. General Motors built one car. It cost the company one set amount to engineer, tool, and manufacture. Then it sold that same car through two different showrooms. And one of those showrooms, Pontiac, was pricing it below the other one. Pontiac wasn't competing against Toyota or Honda anymore. Pontiac was competing against its own sister brand, inside the same parent company, for the exact same customer. Every Pontiac sale that undercut a Chevrolet sale wasn't new business for General Motors. It was the company taking money out of one pocket and putting less of it into the other. GM wasn't just failing to make money on Pontiac. In many cases, the brand was actively losing it and dragging Chevrolet's margins down in the process. Multiply that pattern across decades, across dozens of models, and you get a brand that technically still exists, still has loyal customers, still has dealerships, and is quietly hemorrhaging money every single year. There were flashes of what Pontiac could have still been. The G8, a genuinely excellent rear-wheel drive performance sedan imported from GM's Australian division, showed the old DNA hadn't completely died. The Solstice Roadster, built on its own dedicated chassis with a proper turbocharged engine, reminded people Pontiac could still build something fun. But by the time those cars arrived, it was too little, decades too late, and the financial hole was already too deep to climb out of. Then came 2008. The financial crisis brought General Motors to the edge of collapse. And by 2009, the company was filing for a government-assisted Chapter 11 bankruptcy. As part of the deal to receive taxpayer support, GM was required to slim down dramatically. And that meant deciding, brand by brand, which divisions actually made financial sense to keep. The math wasn't complicated by that point. Cadillac stayed because it was the luxury flagship. Chevrolet stayed because it was the volume seller that moved the most metal. Buick stayed, surprisingly, because of its enormous popularity in China, a market GM desperately needed. GMC stayed because its trucks were consistently profitable. Pontiac had none of those arguments left to make. It wasn't the luxury brand. It wasn't the volume brand. It didn't have a booming overseas market propping it up. And after decades of badge-engineered cars undercutting its own siblings, it wasn't even reliably profitable anymore. On April 27, 2009, General Motors announced Pontiac would be phased out entirely. GM's own vice president of sales, Susan Docherty, later called it one of the hardest decisions of her career. Not because the numbers were unclear, but because everyone inside the company still remembered what Pontiac used to mean. The final car to ever wear the Pontiac badge rolled off the line in early 2010. It wasn't a GTO. It wasn't a Trans Am. It was a fleet-spec white, four-cylinder G6. About as far from excitement as a car could possibly get. A brand that once defined an entire era of American performance ended not with a bang, but with a rental car special nobody even remembers buying. So was it really one bad decision? In a sense, yes. One philosophy, repeated thousands of times across 3 decades. The decision to treat brand identity as an expense to be trimmed rather than an asset to be protected. Every time GM chose to save engineering costs by rebadging instead of building something genuinely distinct, it looked like the smart, responsible, financially sound choice in that specific moment. But identity doesn't erode all at once. It erodes one interchangeable car at a time, until customers can no longer tell you why they choose your badge over the one parked right next to it on the same showroom floor. By the time GM realized what years of badge engineering had actually cost them, in brand equity, in customer trust, in real dollars lost to internal competition, the hole was too deep, and the timing, a global financial collapse, left zero room for a slow rebuild. Pontiac didn't die because Americans stopped wanting excitement. It died because, decision after decision, GM stopped selling it to them. Pontiac isn't the only GM brand that died this exact same way. Oldsmobile fell to almost the identical trap over a decade earlier. If you want to see how a 100-year-old brand disappeared using the same playbook, that video's linked right here. And if you owned a Pontiac, or your family did, drop the model in the comments. I want to know which one you had.